Hi, good evening, everyone. Hi, good evening, everyone. I hope that you're having a really great Thursday night. We are here on our final event for the International Education Summit, and I'm really excited to have Refugees International representative here with us. So we're going to get ready and start going in about another minute, so we can just give attendees a chance to get in. And so we can also connect to our Facebook Live audience. So once again, good evening, everyone. I hope that you're having a great Thursday night. I'm going to go ahead and get us started here. So welcome to the final event of Your Future in the World Summit, sponsored by Northern Kentucky University and Miami University. My name is Michelle Harpenow, and I'm the Executive Director with the World Affairs Council of Cincinnati in Northern Kentucky. We face a pandemic and global warming, neither of which respects borders. At the same time, there is displacement of millions of people across borders. Addressing these problems and others successfully requires a high degree of agreement and collaboration across the world, led by informed global professionals and citizens. We hope that this summit has increased your global understanding of issues that matter and given you some thought-provoking perspectives to help you to address what comes next for our world. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get into our subject matter. Your camera and audio is off, so we cannot see or hear you. If you have any questions during the presentation and don't want to forget, you can go ahead and type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. It kind of looks like two quote bubbles down there, and it can be found in the bottom of your toolbar. Otherwise, you can also drop them in the chat if that's easier. So I'm just going to go ahead and explain and introduce our subject tonight, which we're very excited about. So in conclusion to the summit, Dr. Yael Schacher of Refugees International will give here a keynote address regarding the current state of the Afghan humanitarian and displacement crisis. As 2021 marks the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks that led to the global war on terror, we will learn more about how the US is examining its obligations to the region following the chaos of the Taliban takeover of the government. This session will also address how governments, the United Nations, and various humanitarian organizations have worked and should work together to respond to the needs of Afghans displaced within and outside of Afghanistan. Participants will also learn more about the challenges that face refugees resettling in the US and how they can advocate to ensure the human rights of refugees and migrants around the world. Dr. Schacher will also highlight the factors that brought about the humanitarian evacuation crises, as well as make predictions, which I'm very interested about, on what issues and trends the refugee and humanitarian communities will face in the coming years. I also just want to briefly mention a little bit about the Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky region. There are local nonprofits here working to lead the efforts to support Afghan refugees who have relocated here to our community. Refugee Connect and Catholic Charities of Cincinnati, for example, are the two organizations that are doing work within our region. So be on the lookout for some of the resources after our session so that you can give back and actually support some of these efforts that we're going to learn more about tonight. So on that note, I do want to go ahead and welcome Dr. Yael Schacher, a senior U.S. advocate at Refugees International. She focuses on U.S. asylum, U.S. refugee admissions, temporary protected status, and immigration practices that have refugee protection implications. Prior to joining Refugees International, Yael spent a decade researching the relationship between immigration and refugee policy for her forthcoming book on the history of asylum in the U.S. since the late 19th century. Most recently, Yael was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Texas at Austin, where she combined historical research on asylum and advocacy on behalf of asylum seekers with the law school's immigration clinic and with the organization Justice for Our Neighbors. We are very excited to have her here, and I am going to go ahead and pass it to her so we can learn a little bit more.
Thanks so much, Michelle. And it's really a pleasure to be here. I used to, for many years, I taught history and I miss teaching, and I'm so glad to be with you all to talk a lot about the work I do now, which is, as Michelle said, at Refugees International. Just a little background on Refugees International. Refugees International is a non-governmental organization. It's based in Washington, D.C., and its mission is just to focus on policy advocacy for forcibly displaced people all over the world. We're not a direct service provider like some of the resettlement agencies Michelle mentioned and what I'll talk about later, but we do focus on how to influence policymakers, and many of us, especially before COVID, but now again, travel to different parts of the world where there are crises of forcible displacements. We have different advocates. I work on the United States, in particular, the US southern border and resettlement of refugees in the United States, but we have advocates focusing on all different parts of the world, on Africa, on the Middle East, on Europe, on Latin America, and we also have special programs focused on displacement of women and girls, and the special issues that involves. And also we have a special program on climate displacement. So we have both topical programs and we have sort of regional programs. But our main goal is to sort of to investigate forcible displacement and suggest to policymakers ways of addressing it. And one of our most recent reports, which I worked on with several other people in the program department at the organization, someone who focused on Europe, someone who focused on Afghanistan, and me focusing on resettlement in the United States, we wrote this report called After the Airlift: Protection for Afghan Refugees and Those Who Remain at Risk in Afghanistan, charting out a way forward to deal with this particular refugee crisis. And so I'll talk a little bit about that now. I'll put it in a longer historical context. That's what I'm used to doing. Give you a little background about how refugee resettlement works in the United States, what's going on with the Afghans is part of that process, but also distinct from it. Some concerns about those who remain in Afghanistan and how to facilitate people who are at risk to still be able to leave and seek refuge elsewhere, and then talk about some ways that you can get involved if you're interested in this kinds of work. And some of the, as Michelle mentioned, some of the challenges we face today, not just with Afghans, but with refugee crises elsewhere in the world and for other reasons. So just a quick question to the group, a sort of poll question, a yes or no answer. Do you know who qualifies as a refugee? I asked that question because many people, refugee colloquially is someone, who is forced to flee their home, but actually in US law, it's a much more particular, definition. Not anybody who flees violence, for example, or a crisis in their home country is eligible for refugee status. In 1980, the United States passed the 19 Refugee Act, which established sort of who qualifies as a refugee. A refugee is a person who has fled their home country because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution because of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. So you have to prove that you would be targeted for one of those specific reasons, not just that you're fleeing violence in your home country. And you can qualify for that status in a third country. So you fled your home country and you reach a third country and you can apply for refugee status, and somebody from from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees might interview you, and then the United States, if you wanted to be resettled in the United States, you would be interviewed by someone from the Department of Homeland Security, basically a refugee officer sent overseas to interview you. Or you can apply for refugee status at the border when you apply for asylum, or once already in the United States. That would be asylum. It's the same definition. You have to qualify for the same, refugee status in either way. At the beginning of, just a little bit of background, at the beginning of each fiscal year, the president, in consultation with Congress, sets a cap on the number of refugees to be accepted from overseas through the resettlement process. This number ranged from around 70,000 to around 90,000 between 1999 and 2016. And then in response to the worsening global humanitarian crisis, and especially the crisis in Syria, the Obama administration raised the ceiling to 85,000 in 2016 and then to 110,000 in 2017. Upon taking office, the Trump administration suspended resettlement altogether for 120 days in 2017. And then in subsequent years, it also deprioritized admissions of refugees from particular Muslim and African countries, and lowered the cap each year, going down to 15,000 in 2021. And that lowering of the refugee cap had implications, and lowering of the number of refugees admitted had implications for our refugee resettlement program here in the United States, because a lot of refugee resettlement organizations, since they weren't getting people coming in, closed offices around the country. So when the Afghan crisis came up, we now have a lot of Afghans coming into the country, and we need to kind of ramp up the resettlement program again, open up new offices, build up capacity quite quickly, which had all been sort of ramped down during the Trump administration. And for fiscal year 2022, which starts in October, actually, it's already started. It's a complicated thing, but for fiscal year 2022, the Biden administration has set the cap for 2022 at 125,000 refugees. The confusing thing about that is, and I'll talk more later, none of the Afghan refugees who have been coming in, who have been evacuated, are actually coming in as refugees. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. I just wanted to show a quick slide, if we could put that up, of who has traditionally been resettled in the United States. Like, so who have been the people being resettled in the United States? And I don't know if we can get that slide up, or we can show that slide. Thanks so much. Great. I hope everybody can see it. It's if we can enlarge it, it would be best, right? This is how refugees resettle from overseas by region. And if you look at this slide, the reason I'm showing this to you is because I want you to get a sense of who the refugees have been who have been coming to the United States. And if you see, starting in the late 1970s and all the way essentially through the 1990s, what you're seeing are a lot of people from Vietnam. That's the East Asia, is mostly Vietnamese people. And people, you also see a lot of people coming from the former Soviet Union coming in. More recently, what you see are people coming from Africa. It's a lot of people coming from the Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo have been resettled. A lot of people coming from Myanmar or Burma coming in. A lot of those are Rohingya. Some of you may know about what happened to them, and they've been pushed to Bangladesh, and they've been resettled into the United States. A lot of people coming from the Middle East and the Near East. A lot of those folks are from Iraq, who had been coming in the early 2000s. If you notice, not many Latin Americans are coming in at all. That is the very light green color. As you can see regionally, that's just not that many people. Most of those who have come in were actually coming from Cuba, due to their ability since the 80s to be processed for refugee status from within Cuba. There was a special program for Cubans. To give you an example, many of you may know that Venezuela is now probably one of the biggest refugee crises in the world, maybe just behind the Syrian refugee crisis. Millions of Venezuelans have been displaced from their homes. They're living sort of all over the Americas. 2 million Venezuelans are living in Colombia. But the United States has admitted just 30 Venezuelan refugees through its resettlement project since 2010. And what I want to emphasize here is really the only way for people from Latin America, including those Venezuelans, to gain refugee status is to actually seek it through the asylum system. So that a lot of the Latin Americans and a lot of Venezuelans are the population, the largest nationality applying for affirmative asylum status in the United States, rather than come through our refugee resettlement program, which is what this graph shows you. So I just wanted to give you a sense of the populations coming through. Okay, done with this slide. You can take that down. Thank you. I'll move on to a next poll question. I kind of hinted at the answer already to this, so it's kind of unfair, but have the Afghans who were evacuated this past summer come to the United States as refugees? The technical answer to this question is no. And this is complicated. The United States has welcomed Afghans in need. Oh, look, everybody knew the answer. Fantastic. Okay, it looks like 100%. So the United States has welcomed Afghans in need of permanent resettlement for many years as refugees and as special immigrant visa recipients. And many of those special immigrant visa recipients have worked with our soldiers and our military overseas. And that's why they qualified usually as translators or in some other capacity for those special visas. But then this summer, in late July, the U.S. government began evacuating at-risk Afghans, including individuals affiliated with the United States, to military bases overseas. After security screening over there, many of these Afghans were brought to the United States. And when they were brought here, they were usually granted humanitarian parole for 2 years. Then they got some additional processing on military bases. I think there are 8 right now hosting Afghans. And from those bases, they're connected with refugee resettlement agencies in locations around the country. And these resettlement agencies will help them find housing, secure employment, enroll children in school, get oriented to their new communities. The Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration, it's called PRM, under the U.S. Department of State, created the Afghan Placement and Assistance Program to provide Afghans with humanitarian parole key benefits and services during their first 90 days. These, again, were filtered through the resettlement agencies. And this is actually kind of different from the kind of reception and placement grants that refugees who come in through the resettlement program would have gotten. It's sort of like it's a different program, but it's providing many of those same benefits. And then just 2 weeks ago, PRM also announced an additional sort of sponsor circle program for Afghans, through which groups of sponsors can raise the initial funding for Afghans as they come to resettle. For further support, in September, Congress passed a funding package that authorized Afghans arriving to the United States with humanitarian parole to be eligible for benefits and services provided through the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is under the Department of Health and Human Services. And that includes some cash assistance, medical benefits for 8 months, emergency housing, English language classes, job training, case management, the kind of services that the Office of Refugee Resettlement traditionally provides to refugees. This funding usually is filtered through state governments and through resettlement agencies and other nonprofit community-based organizations to provide these benefits and services for the Afghans or for refugees. Now, this legislation also made Afghans with humanitarian parole eligible for some of the mainstream means-tested benefits, like health insurance through Medicaid and food assistance like food stamps, and they can qualify for those benefits through their local state social services departments. Now, Afghan humanitarian parolees are only sort of eligible for those benefits until March of 2023 or whenever their parole runs out. And although President Biden had asked Congress in this budget process to also provide the Afghan parolees with a pathway to permanent status or legalization, or sort of a way to apply for permanent status, that wasn't passed by Congress yet in this funding package. So what we're going to have as a problem is that because when refugees come to the United States as refugees through the refugee admissions program, they have a clear path to permanency, because when you come in as a refugee, after 1 year of being in the United States, you apply for permanent residency status. In order to ensure that the Afghans have this path to permanency, Congress will actually have to pass another law providing that pathway. This is what Congress did for Cubans and Vietnamese refugees who were paroled into the United States before the Refugee Act in 1980, right? So Vietnamese and Cubans had been coming to the United States in the 1960s, and that was the Cubans. And then for Vietnamese in the late 1970s, before the Refugee Act passed that I mentioned at the top. And so they were also paroled into the United States rather than have be resettled as refugees, which didn't really exist yet until 1980. So what we need is, as Congress did for Cubans and Vietnamese refugees, we need an adjustment act to pass. If Congress does not pass an adjustment act, what's going to happen is that Afghans who did not come in as special immigrant visa applicants, because those folks, once their visas are approved, or if they have a path to permanency. But for those who have been paroled in, they will actually have to apply for asylum in the United States, which is quite a backlogged system, as I'm sure some of you may know if you read the newspapers about sort of some of the problems with our asylum system. And it actually may be difficult for some Afghans to be eligible for asylum, because many of them destroyed their documents on the way out. And so it may be a difficult process. So it will certainly be backlogged, and it may actually be difficult. So getting Congress to pass that Adjustment Act is a key advocacy concern for Refugees International. Other challenges that exist for resettling Afghans now is, and that resettlement agencies are finding, and their affiliates and offices around the country, has to do with ongoing and significant housing challenges for arriving refugees, particularly as housing prices rise, and it's further exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, housing is not just an issue for refugees; it's an issue for everyone. But this is particularly important when you have a lot of people coming quickly into communities. And if you think about it, many Afghans, there are large communities of Afghans already existing in the United States, big pockets in Virginia, big pockets in California, where housing prices are extremely high, and there's not a lot of available affordable housing for refugees. So this is a big issue, and we need people who are interested maybe in taking this issue on, maybe looking at finding affordable housing and housing for refugees as a way of just thinking about how can we make affordable rental housing more available for everyone. I think it's an opportunity to do a lot of creative thinking about how to improve the housing situation in the country for everyone, and focusing on how we can find that affordable housing. This is a challenge at the state and local level, and something that people are looking at, both federal policy to sort of find creative ways to increase availability of housing, but also this is a local problem too, just working with state offices, working with local communities and developers to find, and landlords, basically just to find creative ways to find housing. Probably some of the biggest challenges, though, also to integrating Afghans here in the United States are the people that have been left behind. We evacuated a lot of people, about 125,000 people, some of whom were U.S. citizens and permanent residents, and some of whom were, Afghans at risk, some of whom were SIVs. But there are a lot of people left behind that now can't get out without the documents they need. Many people in the United States, either some of these recent arrivals of Afghans, or families who have lived here for a long time, who came in earlier waves of Afghanistan refugees or as immigrants to the United States, worry about their family members and relatives overseas. So we have a refugee program to resettle Afghans from overseas. Congress over the summer created actually a special refugee program for Afghans who are affiliated with U.S. media companies and other organizations, seeing that they would be particularly targeted by the Taliban. The problem is, in order to sort of access that refugee program, you need to get out of Afghanistan and into a third country. And to access that program, getting to a third country, this is difficult. The Taliban might not let people out, isn't letting people out, and other countries, especially bordering Afghanistan, are starting to close their borders. So the land border with Pakistan is very, very hard to get out. Flights are very hard to get out. The Taliban is requiring certain paperwork. Everybody needs to have a passport from the Taliban. This is hard because passport offices are backed up. You also need, right now, it seems the only people who are being able to evacuate by plane through the government is people who are US citizens, green card holders who have basically approved SIV applicants who have a special travel document that can go with them and their family members. Pretty much everybody else is having a lot of trouble getting out of the country. So the US needs to work to keep the borders open, to create sort of passageways for people to get out. If you do manage to get to a third country, you have to go to a consulate to get your humanitarian parole application moving, or you have to be interviewed by a refugee officer for resettlement. It would help matters if the Biden administration staffed up consulates and embassies, established a special parole program, like a group parole program or a refugee program for particular groups of Afghans, like, let's say, human rights defenders, women's rights advocates, politicians in the former government, religious minorities who are particularly targeted by the Taliban. And, to speed up processing and allow more people who have made it to third countries to come to the United States. So there are a lot of ways we can kind of speed up that process by more staff, more interviews, special programs. So it's not it's not as individualized, but we say, okay, this group of people is going to be particularly targeted. Let's create a priority program for them. But again, to get access to any of those types of programs, you've got to get to that third country. And so that is a definitely an obstacle. Also, crucially, before the Taliban took over, Afghanistan was a country quite reliant on humanitarian aid, especially food aid. It's facing a major drought right now. How can we ensure that aid gets in? The United States does not have a relationship with the Taliban, and in many ways, no Western governments really have relationships with the Taliban. How can we get development aid? How can we get humanitarian aid in without, recognizing the Taliban? This is a major problem. And one of the things we have to think creatively about is how can we use basically the United Nations to get aid in, create funds that get aid to the people who need it in Afghanistan without necessarily working with the Taliban or recognizing the Taliban or giving credence to the Taliban. Basic services, development aid. We don't have a government in Afghanistan to work with, and we need to use diplomacy. We need to use the UN to figure out how to get humanitarian aid to the people who need it. Otherwise, we're going to be faced with a real potentially starvation, a lot of there's malnutrition, a lot of crisis. The similarities with Vietnam are actually quite relevant here. As I mentioned before, we evacuated and paroled in people from Vietnam in 1975 when the war ended. But what's very interesting, and we did not have relations with the Vietnamese government, but despite the absence of official U.S.-Vietnamese relations, after the war, U.S. officials remained willing to sort of meet with Hanoi to discuss migration issues and especially family unification, that issue of joining relatives in the United States. So while condemning Hanoi as a violator of human rights and seeking to isolate the Vietnamese in the international community, U.S. officials simultaneously met with Vietnamese officials to discuss creating something called the Orderly Departure Program and refugee resettlement, which basically allowed family members and some members of the former government, people who are at risk in Vietnam, to Amerasians, people who have been born soldiers who had children while they were serving in Vietnam. All of these people were kind of prioritized for resettlement, and the US negotiated with Vietnamese to allow people to come directly out of Vietnam through this orderly departure program. These policies all became institutionalized with bipartisan support in the years ahead. And as part of the process, importantly, US officials increased their support and willingness to work through multilateral initiatives like with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, sort of facilitating a lot of this and working with other countries. In 1979, the United States convened a huge global conference to basically secure resettlement for Vietnamese, not just in the United States, but in other countries all around the world. People started pledging resettlement. And one of the ways for, for the US, and this is how resettlement has traditionally worked, like if the United States wants Pakistan to keep its border with Afghanistan open so that people can flee and stay in Pakistan, the United States might say, Pakistan, we will support you, we will provide humanitarian aid, we will resettle a certain number of Afghans from Pakistan to the United States. Please, resettlement by other countries is a way of supporting the immediate host country, right? So refugees flee to immediate host country, which hosts a lot of refugees, and resettlement takes a small number of those and resettles them to another country. So in a way, it would be a way of incentivizing Pakistan to keep its border open, to say, we will help you. We are committed to resettling Afghans, and maybe getting other countries like Canada, other countries in sort of the global north to resettle more Afghans. That would increase the likelihood that Pakistan might be willing to keep its border open. I mean, this is how resettlement has traditionally worked. And unfortunately, we're seeing, for many years, there's been a resistance from many countries to resettle, especially in Europe, to resettle large numbers of refugees. And that has meant it made it more difficult to keep borders open, right, in these host countries. Okay, the last poll question would be, do you know how to get involved with helping Afghans and refugee work more generally? And I just wanted to throw out a couple of ways you could get involved. First, you can ask your member of Congress to pass the Afghan Adjustment Act. It's a really important, as I said, it's sort of the key to getting permanent status and really permanent integration into this country. Second, you can consider forming a sponsorship circle to support an Afghan family, or you can really find out how to volunteer with one of the local resettlement agencies that was mentioned. When you volunteer, that would mean you would offer to help a resettlement agency with setting up housing, teaching language, basic things, driving families to medical appointments, mentoring youths. And that's, you can do, of course, you can always donate money to resettlement agencies. But another major thing, as I mentioned before, if you have an extra room or you have an apartment to spare, housing is a huge issue, as I mentioned before. And then finally, jobs. I think the key issue is, is jobs. I mean, the key to sort of after housing, the key thing is getting people into jobs where they can support themselves and use the skills they have, job training, job skills, and just offering jobs, finding jobs for folks. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we face more generally in the refugee environment, and also some of the, I guess, best ways forward or the most productive ways forward. I guess more generally are the tools that we currently have, and that refugee definition I mentioned at the top, it was actually a definition of the refugee that was created way back after World War II in the 1950s. It was sort of the United Nations definition created in the UN Refugee Convention in 1951, that the US sort of incorporated into its law in 1980, 30 years later. So we're talking about a refugee definition from the 1950s. It has a lot of great stuff in it, but then there are a lot of causes of forced displacement that it doesn't take into account. It doesn't really take into account, I was mentioned, people displaced by climate change. Those 5 grounds in the refugee definition don't really say anything about people displaced by climate. It only partially takes into account people displaced by non-state actors, by gangs, by terrorist organizations. Most conflicts today are civil wars fueled by outside powers, and they're extremely protracted. In other words, they're inside a country, even if they're fueled by outside powers. They happen internally, they're protracted, and what's even worse, most times in many conflicts, there's the different parties who are of the conflict put limits on humanitarian aid coming in. If you think about Yemen, if you think about the conflict now going on in Ethiopia, where there's no humanitarian aid getting in, there's about to be another famine in Ethiopia. That's the kind of conflicts we have now. We also have the problem, as I mentioned before, poor countries are hosting the most refugees, and rich countries are not as willing to resettle and take refugees in. And so if you have a lot of refugees in poor countries, you also have problems with access to healthcare, education, and work. Many refugees are children. Increasing numbers of refugees are children. You also have other issues that aren't accounted for in the refugee definition, like violence. Gender violence, for example, isn't really comfortably within the refugee definition. So all women fleeing gender-based violence, that's another major issue. So there's a lot there are a lot of gaps in our protection system that really, we need to fill in with new solutions. And there is a piece of legislation called the Refugee Protection Act that I've been working on to sort of fill some of those gaps. It's been introduced a few times. Hopefully it will be introduced again to sort of say, okay, should we set up a complementary protection system for people displaced by climate? What can we do to address that problem? Because increasingly people are displaced for a reason that's completely unaddressed in our definition. Now, President Biden and the White House has recently released a report on migration and forced migration as a result of climate, and has talked about ways that we could kind of use some of the protections that we have in our system, like temporary protected status, which is a temporary protection for people in the country, a relief from deportation for people, so as not to send them back to countries that just had an
It seems like we might be having a little bit of technical difficulty. So if you will give us just a moment, and hopefully Yael will be back, I can actually go ahead and answer one of the questions while Yael takes a moment to come back onto screen. Oh, Yael, are you back? Can you hear me? Well, hopefully she comes back in a moment. So I did want to answer just one of the questions about how someone locally in Cincinnati can help people being resettled in our area. It looks like some of the answers were put into the chat box, so I'll just make sure to say those out loud. One of the organizations that's helping to do the resettlement in Cincinnati specifically is Catholic Charities of Cincinnati. And so that's the link to look at for the Cincinnati side. There are 50 Afghan refugees being resettled in Cincinnati specifically. And then on the Northern Kentucky side, we have Refugee Connect, who is leading that effort. And they are leading that effort in collaboration with Northern Kentucky Ministries, as well as the Northern Kentucky Chamber of Commerce and a few other groups in Northern Kentucky. There are also only about 50 Afghan refugees being resettled in Northern Kentucky. So in total in our region, we have about 100 Afghan refugees who are being resettled in this area. Yael, are you coming back? I can see you, but I don't know that we can hear you.
And I just wanted to add, there was a good question in the chat about the 5 qualifications for refugee status. So just to reiterate, this is from NOLO, a legal organization. One of the 5 category for refugee status is race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. So while Yael rejoins us here in a moment, I just wanted to make sure we shared that information.
Thanks so much, Erica. So it looks like Yael will be joining us hopefully in just a moment. And what's really nice is we do actually work with Refugee Connect throughout the year. They're a really great resource that actually helps to meet with a lot of our international visitors, was just another aspect of our work that we do in the community. And we're still doing exchanges through the US Department of State's program. So they're really great to connect with when visitors come into town. Yael, are we back with you?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Oh, great. Fantastic.
I love
I
all
will pass it back to you.
Okay, thank you so much, and I'm sorry for the technical glitch. Yeah, so I think I left off talking about challenges, and some of the ways that we need to sort of revamp our system, and some of the ways that there's some new legislation that's being introduced to account for some of those gaps, like provide a complementary protection system for people fleeing climate violence. Other kind of interesting things that we've worked on and we've used in the past that may work for some of the gaps is, like, for example, I mentioned the problem of keeping the Pakistan border open. What are the problem of poor countries? Right now, Pakistan already hosts millions of Afghans who fled previously who've been leaving Afghanistan since the 1980s for various reasons because of war and violence there. So how do we keep Pakistan and support Pakistan in its hosting of Afghans? So one way we could do it is we could establish a refugee compact with Pakistan and perhaps other neighboring countries. We've had those kinds of refugee compacts in Jordan, for a refugee compact in Jordan, which hosts a lot of refugees as well. And it was a way for other countries in the world to support host countries hosting a lot of refugees. The compact could offer grants and financing to fund services and educational opportunities and create jobs for refugees and host communities in Pakistan and other countries. So it would sort of be a net gain for Pakistan, for both its own population and for all the Afghans it was hosting. And another thing I just wanted to mention that is starting to sort of happen here in the United States, as I said, a lot of the refugee resettlement agencies are sort of scrambling now to revamp their capacity and need volunteers like you to help out with Afghans. One thing that Canada has is sort of an innovative model that allows private companies and individuals and organizations to directly fund resettlement of refugees, and this sort of private sponsorship model, sort of starting a little bit with those sponsorship circles that I mentioned, but also the Biden administration has indicated it would like to support a private sponsorship where basically people in the United States would work with the State Department, sort of match up with refugees in other countries and then sponsor them for resettlement in the United States. And aside from that, obviously the private sector companies can also really get involved by donating goods and services. That's already happening in the United States. So Airbnb, you may have heard, has sort of stepped up to provide temporary housing. Law firms basically provide pro bono legal services to a lot of refugees. Companies can commit to hiring a certain number of refugees and that kind of thing. So there are a lot of ways in which basically to sort of improve the private public coordination and working on this. And that I think is a way to sort of increase capacity fast, especially as we try to rebuild our refugee system, which had sort of been in decline for the past couple of years and now needs to meet this new emergency. So I will stop talking there and maybe we can have some questions.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Schacher. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us tonight. And, despite technical difficulties, it was very interesting talk, and we do have quite a few questions. I do want to mention quickly, though, just for our group, from our side, one of our board members of the World Affairs Council, Michael Hawkins, is also was on the board of Refugees International for about 13 years and is now emeritus board member. He did 4 mission trips with Refugees International, so has also a lot of experience. So if you ever want to meet someone here in Cincinnati as part of Refugees International, just let us know. We can connect you as well. But on to the questions. So I'm going to start with 2 kind of, I think, short questions to answer. So 1, is there a cap on asylum seekers in the US? And then the second question is, once the Afghans are paroled, like their Afghan parole ends, will they not have a legal status to stay?
Great questions. So there used to be a cap. Well, there never really was a cap on asylum. There was a cap on how many asylum seekers could, if they want asylum, apply for that permanent status. That when asylum was first created, that existed. It no longer exists now. And just to give, so there is no cap on asylum. About 20 to 30,000 asylum seekers receive refugee status, so win asylum in recent years. Each year, about 20,000 or so have been winning asylum each year. So that's basically been the number of asylees. Somebody who's won asylum is called an asylee or a refugee. Somebody who hasn't yet won would be an asylum seeker, right? The other question, so right, after the parole status ends after 2 years, they would technically be out of status. Potentially, they could get an extension, although again, they would have to apply for that on an individual basis to renew their parole. And what we've seen is that winning asylum can take longer than 2 years. One of the things that the package of funding from Congress provided that I mentioned earlier was a bunch of money for the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services to sort of staff up to be able to handle anticipated asylum claims from Afghans should an Afghan Adjustment Act not pass. So anticipating that like there may be a whole bunch, like tens of thousands of new asylum claims in the system, and also sort of mandated a speeded up, asylum process that you have your hearing on a quicker timeline. So potentially, if if parolees start applying for asylum right now, basically get a lawyer and start applying for asylum right now, there'd be a good chance that within a year they win asylum if successful. But there's also a chance if for folks who have not yet arrived in the United States and will not be paroled in, they're gonna have to quickly apply for asylum in order not to fall out of status like within 2 years. The answer to that question. And the other thing is that parolees have work authorization. They can apply for work authorization. That's one of the benefits of parole. Like it's a legal status and you can apply for work authorization, but that work authorization would also lapse, obviously, right? With the end of the parole status. So you'd really end up with people who not only have no legal status, if they hadn't won asylum yet, but would also not have any ability to work or anything like that. So that's why I think the Afghan Adjustment Act is so important, like a path to permanency, because you will have people who've been here for 2 years and then fall out of status if they haven't yet won asylum. And the other thing is that, it also shows why it's important to actually use our refugee system, which has that built in path to permanency. Like that's the whole point of coming in as a refugee rather than as a parolee.
So this is more geared towards Refugees International and what you guys are doing. So is Refugees International assisting those high-risk Afghans to depart Afghanistan? Are you advocating at the State Department? And what is the main problem in getting all those we left behind into another country and then potentially the US?
So I mean, in private capacities, in our ways, some of us are working with individual Afghan families to try to help get people out. But as an organization, we're mostly focusing on policy advocacy, right? We don't represent clients. We are focusing on, exactly as the first person asked, like, talking to State Department, talking to the Department of Homeland Security about ways in which, and the Department of Defense, frankly, ways in which to get more Afghans out of the country, and to push for diplomatic engagement in certain ways to facilitate crossing borders and keeping land borders open. I think the biggest barrier right now has to do with documents and the Taliban not letting people leave. Basically, the other big problem is the land border with Pakistan is basically closed. And so the only way out is by plane. And so, these are all problems. The other problem is that the other land borders with Afghanistan one is with Iran, for which we also do not have diplomatic relations. So it becomes a complicated. So there's one major country that Afghans are going to that we don't have a refugee program from Iran, like Iran itself, right? So if you get to Iran, you're now in Iran, you're not able to resettle from there. So that's another problem. And I think one of the main things for the United States to do is, again, talks and figuring out ways to keep both the Pakistani border open, basically, and with the Taliban to let more people out, like family members, relatives out of Afghanistan, especially. I mean, that would probably be the easiest first population to get out. And then, as I said, like, even once you get to third countries, we haven't really been sending. We have to send more refugee officers to start interviewing people overseas. Because of COVID, a lot of that stopped. One of the reasons that Afghans are applying for humanitarian parole from these third countries, humanitarian parole used to be a program that was just for like 1,000 people a year, usually at the US southern border in medical emergency cases. It wasn't supposed to be a program for lots and lots of refugees. That's what the refugee program is for. So Afghans applying for humanitarian parole once they get to Pakistan, for example, is just also not usually the way we did things. Instead, we would have sent refugee officers to interview people overseas. So we have a lot of work to do to get that system up and running again, and we're not really doing that yet. So that's another point of pressure that we're putting on the State Department. Basically, get the State Department to issue documents to whoever they can, if that means providing transit letters or transport letters for as many people as possible, even not just SIVs, for which they are providing that now, but maybe for people who would qualify as refugees, to provide them with transit documents to get them out of the country. Again, that might help a little bit. And then to make sure that for Afghans who have gone to third countries, to facilitate them, because one of the problems is there have been some Afghans who have managed to get out of the country, not through the evacuation flights, the official evacuation flights run by the military and the State Department, but on private charters in their own ways, through various private efforts to get people out of Afghanistan. And they've ended up not on bases, like not in Qatar or Germany, where many of the evacuation flights have landed for the initial screening before coming to the United States. And those people are sort of outside the system. There's no sort of clear refugee path for them to get on, for them to get screened, to get resettled. So there's also work in other countries the State Department has to do to make sure their consulates are aware of folks and people know how to apply for refugee status if they get to these other countries.
And just as a follow-up to that, is there something specific that Refugees International is doing to help get out the potentially 100,000 at-risk Afghans that are still in the country?
So again, we're not chartering private planes and sneaking in. We can't, what we're doing is we're putting pressure on the State Department to increase the number of people they're willing to accept and to negotiate safe passage for people out of the country, either at a diplomatic level, with intermediaries like the UN, which can sometimes do work we can't do with the Taliban, and through pressure on the Pakistani government to help, working with governments like Qatar, who have had success and sort of working with the Taliban to get more people out to there. So again, we have to work creatively and diplomatically, to get more people out of Afghanistan. So that's been what we've been focusing our attention on, pushing the government to use all those diplomatic levers.
So switching gears a little bit, there was a comment about how interesting it was to hear about the affordable housing issues that are impacting refugee resettlement and how those are linked. This person says, I hadn't thought about that intersection before. So are there any areas or countries that are doing resettlement particularly well or successful, and perhaps having different refugees settle in areas that have even struggled with depopulation?
Right. So one of the things that is sort of built into our resettlement system is, unless you have like a close relative or family member that you're joining in the United States, which applies to some of the Afghans who are coming in, the idea actually is to resettle people, kind of disperse people around the country to places that have services, that have available housing. And this is why, like, the State Department sort of assigned a certain number of people to come to Cincinnati, a certain number of people to go to Kentucky, a certain number of people to go to Oklahoma, you're like, not everybody can go to California or Virginia, like, because that will just create an immense bottleneck. And for various reasons, the goal of resettlement has always been to send refugees to places where there are available resources, sort of spread people out so as not to oversaturate any particular area, so then it just becomes a crisis. So that is sort of has been a part of our resettlement system from the get-go, from the beginning. The problem is that we've been in like a housing crisis, like in much of the country for like a lot of time. So it's sort of like, even dispersing people, we're still in a situation where there's not a lot of affordable housing in some places. So that is a problem. And there are some states in the United States that are using, like Michigan created like a very interesting fund, allocating resources through special housing. I know Oregon did the same thing. I mean, different states at local levels, and even here in near where I live in Arlington, Virginia, the town council created a fund for housing. There's some innovative ways to use both federal rent assistance and housing vouchers for Afghans, and also at the local level to work with landlords and development and tax breaks and things like that. There are a lot of ways to create affordable housing, and I'm happy to share with this group a really spiffy housing options, sort of policy possibilities, sort of creative ways of thinking about finding housing that I can share with Michelle and to circulate to everybody, as a sort of resource to think about creative ways to find housing. I would say Canada is usually held up as a model of a country who has done resettlement right or creatively. Mostly though, it hasn't. Canada has a different system than we do. There's more of a public benefits infrastructure built into the Canadian system that we don't have in this country. So some sort of public guarantees for people exist there that don't exist here. But I think what's innovative about the Canadian system is that, like, sort of that harnessing of also, besides their like more robust public benefit system in Canada, but they also have actually a more robust linkage between private and public efforts on resettlement. So they have this whole private resettlement system that's like apart from it, that really harnesses just like local initiative. And there was a new initiative that started here in the United States. You can look it up. It's called, if you look up like welcome.us, it's one of these initiatives trying to bring local governments, private companies, and volunteers together to sort of support Afghan resettlement. It's modeled on the Canadian system in many ways, to sort of try to harness all of that together, because there's been an outpouring of support pretty much across the country for Afghans. And part of the problem is just coordinating that and making sure it gets like, people are hooked up where there's an effort to, where there's support available.
Well, that brings us basically to our time. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to Dr. Yael Schacher. It's been a pleasure to have you here representing Refugees International and talking about this subject matter. We've really enjoyed it, and there's been some really good discussion. It seems like there could be, much longer talk as well. But I just want to say thank you so much. And also thank you to our attendees who are here with us tonight. As I mentioned, this is our last event for the International Education Summit. So we're really thankful for everyone who's attended all of the events over the last 2 weeks. We did drop a survey into the chat box, and it'll also come in an email after this event as well. So once more, thank you so much. I hope everyone has a really great holiday season. We're almost into Thanksgiving and it just keeps going from there. So also happy Diwali. And thanks so much for joining us tonight again. We will see you soon, hopefully. Thank you.